maybe we could start out with your thoughts on the global economy, and are there pitfalls or areas of concern that you see on the horizon?
Sure. First, before I do, let me say it's really a pleasure and honor to be here. Joe DeZuera, who's the father of three, either current or former students at Fordham Prep, asked me to do this, and I said, of course. But the real reason I wanted to do it is I used to live in New Rochelle and commute on the train with a lot of young men from Fordham Prep. They were, roughly speaking, well-behaved. And I wanted to come and see what they looked like as they matured. And I would say, you continue to look, roughly speaking, like you're well-behaved. Anyway, it's an honor to be here. I want to thank Father Devon. It's nice to have someone praying for me in public. As he pointed out, probably a lot of people had to pray for me to help me get to where I am today, and that's probably true. And I say one other thing. My kids did not go to Catholic schools, but I and my kids both went to religiously oriented schools. And I think this is a really important thing that you're doing here, to bring some spirituality in the education of young men. So with all of that as an opening, to tell you how grateful I'm to be here, the answer to your question is I think we see the global markets and global economy is really pretty challenged right now. It's quite obvious that Europe is having trouble pulling itself consistently out of recession. That may well be because of both short-term cyclical reasons, as we say in economics, or maybe secular, maybe a longer challenge. The Chinese are working really hard to rebalance the economy away from investment and saving towards consumption, and that's never easy, but certainly very difficult in a large economy like that. And here in the U.S., though it doesn't feel like it, we are well advanced in a modest recovery on an annual basis that is not feeling as though it's as robust as people would like and feels a little fragile. So everywhere you look in the major parts of the world, I'd say the glass is distinctly feeling as though it's half empty, not half full. And then you throw in uncertainty around Brazil and Russia, two of the big engines of growth out of the emerging market, and you can sort of understand why markets are feeling a little fragile right now because the background, though not all gloom and doom, doesn't feel as robust as people would like, I'd say.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. So Father covered the mechanism of markets and making sure that we understand what this, certainly this group feels the pressure that you get from the media that, basically greed and incompetence was the driver of the last financial crisis. But if you read more what academics are saying and policymakers, they're talking about imbalances.
Right. And
do you have any thoughts on how imbalances played a role in the recent financial crisis versus greed and incompetence?
So when you get to this kind of crisis, the honest answer is there's probably a little bit of everything, right? Okay. Undoubtedly, there was a certain amount of greed that got individuals mis-selling and mis-buying products. There was clearly incompetence across lots of different parts of the economy, including the regulatory structure. But there was also, and is still, an imbalance that's really global and important. And there are two kinds of imbalances I'm going to talk about. One is the imbalance that we have in the U.S. between consumption and savings, and it's mirrored in other parts of the world. And the way that played into the crisis is that interest rates were, in some cases, not consistent with necessary return or necessary reward for the risk being taken. And so that was a little bit of an imbalance. But there's another big imbalance that's going on that I think actually played into the crisis in a bigger way. It's the imbalance that we're talking about a lot now, which is the imbalance between relatively well-off people and folks who aren't so well-off. It's now being talked about in terms of income inequality. This played into the crisis because, an answer that a lot of us had around income inequality was to get more modest and low-income people into home ownership. We tend to think in America and other places, particularly in the U.S., that owning a home is this bedrock step towards the middle class. And there was an implicit, explicit, well-understood policy to try to get more moderate income people into home ownership. That fed into this subprime exposure, which clearly, in hindsight, was way overboard. And so, there's this fundamental kind of imbalance. It sort of talks a little bit to what the Father was talking about that still exists. And it frankly, I think, was the created a fertile ground for individuals to create new products and services that were missold to individuals trying to get onto the ladder of the American dream. So it's a fairly, in all honesty, sort of sad and sobering story that we ended up experiencing out of, in some sense, an effort to bring people into the American middle class, the only tool that we thought would work. And that proved in hindsight to give opportunities for people to missell and to misbuy, to be a little dishonest about the nature of the products, and frankly a little bit dishonest about their ability to resell or to repay. And so there was that sort of fundamental imbalance that still exists in America, that I think was sort of the sociology that created fertile ground for this kind of behavior.
Do you think the pendulum has swung too far? Is there enough credit out, or are folks not getting into home ownership?
The answer is there's both simultaneously too much and too little credit. Too little credit in the sense that, no doubt for most individuals of middle class nature, terms and conditions around lending are still pretty tight, frankly. Right. Banks are still pretty cautious because, in part, not only, but in part because of regulation, for sure. At the other end, obviously, if you're very well off, this has been a pretty good time. A lot of credit extension for those at the very, very upper end. And that is sort of playing into, I think, some of what we see in the election, frankly. And so I think we have a little bit of a challenge where we're still not allocating credit to folks who need it most. And those of us who are really lucky in the world are finding that we're getting plenty of opportunities to get credit.
Okay. And we're talking about credit and we're talking about savings. I've watched several of your YouTube videos. In fact, preparing for this presentation, I was sent a list of YouTube videos, and I would watch them on Saturdays. And my wife once walked by and goes, "Does Roger have his own television show?" Right, so it was almost always on. But we had talked about savings, and you're very passionate about savings. Yeah. And you feel that Americans don't save enough, and there are certain stats. Pew Charitable says that less than one-third of Americans has no savings at all. 63% of Americans can't come up with $500. But this ties into, we're a very consumer-based society, and our culture has shifted just to keep our economy going. So how do we reconcile that? How do we bring that back into line?
So look, I think this issue around savings is really very important. It's very important for individuals for reasons that you point out. Far too many folks don't even have what's called a lifeline account, enough to deal with $500 of an emergency. That ends up bankrupting people, sadly, if you have one of those events that occurs in your life. So it's really important for individuals to be saving more because the government, frankly, is not going to be able to support all of us as we get older. But it's more important than that, and I do feel passionately about both of these things. From a macroeconomic standpoint, it's really important for all of us to be in a saving kind of culture. We tend to think that the only way to drive a modern economy is through consumption because 2/3 of our GDP is driven around expenditures and consumption. But the challenge with that is we are underinvesting as a society in lots of things. We're underinvesting in infrastructure. I happen to think we're underinvesting in education. We're underinvesting in the future, frankly. And so from my standpoint, this imbalance between saving and consumption is, I think, an Achilles heel for the U.S. I don't want to sound too dire. This is great. You come to lunch at Yale, and this guy comes to talk about all these terrible things that are going to happen. No dessert. Get back there to work. No, but I do think that, just as the Chinese have tended to, in some sense, save too much, and therefore they have invested an awful lot, we have saved too little, and we've invested too little in things like infrastructure. And back to your earlier point, these so-called imbalances, at a global level, it is the U.S. saving shortfall married to the Chinese excess of savings that is creating some of the challenges that we're confronting in financial markets. Let me stop for a minute. Does any of that make sense to people in the room? Yeah. I don't want to, okay. I don't want to sound totally pointy-headed here, even though I am pointy-headed, so, as you can see.
Anyway. You're in good company, though.
Yeah. No, but I stop because this is really important that you understand. I'm not here just, I'm hoping to impart some information, so it's important that you folks understand what I'm saying. So.
Before we go on, any other questions, or because we can, anyone?
Yes, if I may ask, a lack of sufficient savings in the U.S. Do you think that's because individuals do not save enough, or do you think that's because of possibly government dissavings by deficit spending?
Right. But it starts first with individuals, right? Because at the end of the day, it's only individuals and businesses that actually generate wealth and decide what to do. And so individuals, I think, are going to have to save a lot more. When I was on the Fed board, we had periods when the measured savings for individuals was negative, which is to say, because asset prices, particularly house prices, were continuing to rise, people were borrowing against their house price in order to consume. Right now, the savings rate is relatively high for us, around 4 or 5%, I think is the measured rate. Don't quote me on that, but it's low single digits. We should have a savings rate, individuals, that is much higher than that. The government obviously then does play a little bit of a role because we have been running deficits for some time. But I don't want us to get off easy as individuals by saying, oh, it's all about government savings. No, it actually starts with individuals. So I think we all have to think about that. The government can play a role, by the way, in incenting more savings. And we don't tend to have a tax system, for example, that encourages people to save or invest as much as I think it should. So, okay. Are we going to go to straight Q&A?
No. I just want to make sure we have 2 questions, and I'll go back to Q&A.
We have one over here. This gentleman wants to go to.
When you were on the Fed, you guys talk about Hayek's perspective on the business cycle and the role of the Fed in terms of increasing the amount of malinvestments, mostly because of cheap, more liquidity in the market. It seems that the concern is about savings. You would want to increase the interest rates to have more reward for savings, as opposed to what we have now, where you have rising prices. Why would you want to save? You're not getting rewarded for it. You might as well spend the money now because it's not going to be worth as much tomorrow.
Right. So it will not surprise you to say that a Hayekian view of the world has become much more interesting post-crisis than it was pre-crisis, which is, put it another way, the primary role of the Fed is to try to smooth out short-term cycles, keep inflation under control, and return us to maximum employment. That's what the law says. Having said that, when I was on the Fed, and certainly since then, these concerns that you're raising around financial instability, the role of low interest rates for too long, creating imbalances, has certainly become a bigger issue. You obviously are well educated in this space. The Fed has been, I think inappropriately, but has been criticized for keeping rates too low after the dot-com bubble, for example. I don't think that happens to be the case, but there are pretty good academics, John Taylor in particular, who would go a little bit into your space. And certainly, again, since you're more than averagely well-versed in this, as you know, the Bank for International Settlements has also been pretty critical of very, very low interest rates leading to the kinds of imbalances you're talking about. And so, to be fair, there have been arguments on both sides, and the role of low rates creating imbalances has become much more of a topic among central bank community than it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago.
So I get paid by the question, so we'll come back.
And you may not know this, but Fordham Prep needs you to get paid a lot more.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's cheering all around.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know you're glad you invited me here.
Oh, no. Listen, it'll cost me in the end anyway. So a question, I've heard, again, watching Roger television, that how important your father was in introducing you to finance. And the question I have is the parental role, but is the introduction of finance more complicated now because we have a lot of more personal debt, you have credit cards, you have all sorts of lending opportunities. So I guess the question is the role of the family, how it impacted you, and is it different than it was back then?
Sure. My father absolutely was pivotal to my understanding of finance. My father was a very unusual person. He was a product of the Depression, and the Depression affected people differently. For my father in particular, he became very interested in banks and interest rates and finance and how this sector could bring the entire economy to its knees just as he was sort of growing up. And so when most dads would spend their time talking to their kids about box scores and baseball and football stats, my father spent all of it literally, literally all is too much. The vast majority of his time speaking to me about interest rates. He had no money. He was a GS7, for those who know what that is. That's a very, very low-level government employee. But he was worried on a daily basis about CD rates, and should he take his $1,000 from this bank to that bank. And it was a bizarre, you young men couldn't imagine going home to your father all the time talking about interest rates and the stock market being up and down. But that fed into my deep, deep interest in economics that then really took off when a guy named Andrew Bremer, whom none of you probably know, but he was the first black guy appointed to the Fed, was appointed when I was 14 or 15. So I was very lucky to grow up in a house that was very financially literate, though we didn't have much money. My father had me balancing a checkbook when I was in 7th grade. I think I started doing family finances. Wasn't much to do, but nevertheless, I did it. And I was helping to do, I'll stop there, but there's lots of different ways. Is it different now? I think it's similar and different. Similar in that the basic lessons of saving, thinking about interest rates, understanding how markets work, that's all still the same. Sure, the products have become a lot more complicated. So in my father's day, it was mainly around putting in non-competitive bids for government bonds and small stuff like that. Yeah, it's a lot more complicated these days, but still, you can teach a young person the basics around the kitchen table.
Right.
And that is unchanged. And the thing that has changed, I think, is the financial literacy of most adults in America is woefully low. And if the adult population is not feeling very comfortable, they can't possibly educate their kids. And with all due respect to the faculty at Fordham Prep, when I was at the Fed, we were trying to do financial literacy through schools, and we discovered teachers weren't feeling comfortable about this. And so I think the problem that we have as a society in this space is this, literacy of this type, which was never very high, has continued to decline, and therefore it's hard to translate it from one generation to the other.
It's interesting. My father turned 90 last week, and he grew up in the Depression.
Yeah.
And it leaves a lasting impression.
It actually does. It's
in the
amazing.
sense at 90, he's still, where's this money going?
Yeah, he's very frugal.
Yeah, well, at least he's not accusing me of, doing his checkbook, right? wouldn't want to do that. So, but we had talked about changing culture. We had talked about changing from a consumer society. How do we start the process? Or how would you recommend we start the process?
Well, I would,
it's an easy question.
it's an easy question. There are a couple of things I think one can do. One is this financial literacy I've talked about. Frankly, though, I don't think we'll ever get there. I actually think we ought to rethink the tax code a little bit. And now would widely be described as being a moderate Democrat, and what I'm going to say is not the view of either party as far as I can tell. But I actually think we ought to have a value-added tax, or we should move from income tax to a consumption-based tax. Now, we'd have to think about poor people and a lot of technical things. That's a pretty radical move, and I don't think we'll ever get there or anytime soon, but I would put that squarely on the table. Failing that, I'm sure each person could have other modifications they'd make around the tax system. But I would also really drive savings vehicles, which I'd say this administration has done, for example. Most of you don't know it, but this administration has created something called a MIRA, which is a small IRA. They've been encouraging what's called secure choice, which is a state version of savings. These are fairly technical things, but the point I'm making is there are policy towards driving towards more savings that a federal government can do. So I think there are some opportunities there. The other thing that I would certainly say is we go into a season where we're probably going to see out of the new administration some version of tax reform. Let's make sure that the elements of the tax system that are encouraging savings, retirement savings in particular, are not pulled back, because I think that would be a real loss here.
Yeah, listen. So one question, Father had mentioned 9/11. And again, listening to your story, I remember, and I think the rest of the room would remember exactly where they were on 9/11. And my lens became very narrow. Yeah. And it became, what's going on with my family, and how am I going to get the people who work for me home? Because we don't know what's going on. But thinking about it, the rest of the world then looked to the Fed, right? And as I understand it, you were a bit on your own at that time.
Yes, I was.
So maybe for the folks who don't know the story, would you mind just sharing it? Because it
Sure.
is quite fascinating that decisions had to be made, and you hear about government bureaucracy.
Right.
There was no time for that.
Right. Well, look, to be fair, I was the only governor in Washington at the time. Because telecommunications was also pretty much knocked out, I couldn't communicate with any of the other governors. And Chairman Greenspan was on an airplane flying back from Switzerland, so he was completely out of pocket. It's not quite fair to say I was on my own in the sense that the Fed has and had then a really loyal staff around the country. But it fell to me to make the major decisions. The first decision was, should we stay open or close? And decided to stay open. Frankly, the second decision was, should I follow the president's orders to evacuate the building, which I did not do. He did not call me a week later and accuse me of treason, but I disobeyed his order on that point. And then more seriously, we then had to say, okay, once we're going to be open, what are we going to do? And the most important thing I was worried about, and I'll come back and talk about the family thing in 1 second, was making sure that a very, very tragic and deep crisis at the heart of the financial capital of the world, Wall Street, did not spill over and have lasting effects anyplace else. You may not recall, or you may, that during that time, the U.S. economy was just getting out of a recession. It was sort of weak growth, and we were worried about it. So a number of decisions that we made, first, in a very simple mechanical way, was to make sure there was ample cash in all ATMs, because I did not want people going to ATMs and not being able to get cash out. That would have created a sense of crisis, and particularly true here in Manhattan. And so we had the National Guard escort a bunch of trucks with cash into the city to get it into ATMs. And I'm really proud that, as far as I know, only one ATM in Manhattan or anywhere in the country ran out of money over that period of time. That was small in the sense of money, large in the sense of retail. More importantly, we decided that the Federal Reserve would honor every check that was written over the next 3 or 4 days. Most of you don't realize this. Well, you probably do realize it now. When you write a check, it's not automatically cleared if it's of a large amount. There has to be a process of making sure that you have money in your bank account. Since the banks couldn't communicate with each other, I said, well, look, we'll take all the credit risk for all the country for the next 2 or 3 days. It didn't position it that way, but that's what ended up happening. And so the Fed's balance sheet ballooned to well over $1 trillion. It was the largest balance sheet the Fed had ever had until they started these quantitative easing. We did a number of other things as well in terms of allowing banks to send money overnight, a variety of other things. But at the end of the day, the big message was flooded the system with more than enough liquidity so that even though banks themselves could not communicate, they could communicate with us and we could get enough liquidity out to the system. And the good news is it worked.
Right.
I would not be sitting here today had it not worked. I would have been hiding under a rock someplace.
Well, at least the questions would be different.
The question would be, no one would want to hear. There would be no excuse that was good enough. In the midst of all this, I'm like you. I was a father. I have my son was in the 4th grade, 3rd grade. My daughter was in pre-K. She didn't have any idea what was going on. My son went to was going to, at that time, an all-boys school, not dissimilar from Fordham Prep. Not nearly as good as Fordham. And he went home with one of his friends, and they're older. They were looking at the TV. And he called me once an hour for most of the day. And I had to also deal with that. It was pretty tough. I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed about this.
Oh, embarrassed.
But it's really tough. And what you know, but most of you folks don't, my wife was the head of market regulation at the SEC. She was responsible for keeping markets operating. And so not only could I not go home, but my wife couldn't go home. And we had this, it turned out totally fine, but our son was a little stressed. In hindsight, he's recognized what we did, and he's very grateful for it. But it was a tough day because I couldn't get people out of the building,
Right.
and I couldn't get my kid. My kid was safely, but not he wasn't safely. I couldn't sort of deal with him in a moment. So it was an interesting day, an interesting week, because actually, even when Greenspan came back, I still ran the system while he was thinking about other things, and so that's the story.
Yeah, we had an alumni parish, so
It was
as you can
hard.
imagine.
It was hard.
But so
We should move on to lighter, easier talk. We talked about the economy, lack of
Well,
savings,
which exactly.
9/11.
Don't worry, I'm waiting. As we get toward the end, I'm going to hit you with the curriculum question, so it'll be fine.
You guys should be eating, somewhere are eating dessert. You're young men here.
Yeah,
not
Paul, you
eating
can have my dessert. That's fine. Go right ahead. You've been eyeing it since I got up here.
I
Just
know.
take it.
Go on and eat, please.
So, as part of the board, what we do is we sit and we work with the faculty and administration to make sure that our curriculum is staying current, is preparing our students not for today, but 20 years from now. And the thought would be is we're looking to change the curriculum in a sense, maybe a better job of educating our students on financial literacy. If you were part of the administration or in my seat, how would you construct a curriculum? Because then I can say it's Roger endorsed when I ram it through.
See, you didn't give me the answer, so now my suspicion around the Fordham Prep curriculum is it's got some fundamental strengths around values, around treating people with respect, obviously with a strong Christian overlay, a Catholic overlay. I would presume you'd never change that, obviously. Right. I would absolutely encourage you to think about 4 or 5 things that are pivotal. To what degree are you training these young men to be doing critical thinking? It's sort of a cliche, but I think it's really important because they are going to be leaders, and therefore they're going to have to be able to ask really good, challenging questions, and think through the answers. I presume, knowing a bit about Fordham Prep, having seen the young men on the train occasionally, and being in New York, you've got to have a strong sense of multiculturalism, which I think is just going to continue to be important. And I don't mean that in sort of a light, sort of soft way, but a really deep understanding that other parts of the world are different from who we are. Not that they're better or worse, they're different. And you have to understand, have a lot of empathy and understanding around that. Obviously, in a light, simple way, languages are going to be really important for these young men. I don't know the degree to which you require modern languages. Being a Jesuit school, I'm sure you require Latin. Do you still require Latin? See? Right.
We're not going to let you down.
No, right, so hold on to Latin, but then add some modern languages to it as well. And the degree that you can give them, it's a little hard in school, but you're doing it here. If I were running a school that was so close to New York City, I'd figure out how to leverage all of that is in New York City to answer some of these multicultural language questions. And obviously, you got to continue to focus in on the hard stuff, the math, the reading. I'm sure you do the 3 R's quite well if I know my Jesuit education. So, most of this, I'm sure Fordham Prep would do really quite well with the Jesuit background, the kind of great leader that you have, and the financial wherewithal that's going to come from the board. I'm sure it would be great.
Exactly. It's like the Fed's open window or your guarantee. It'll be fine. So maybe the thought would be is if it's all right, Father, because we had a lot of questions before, if we could start with any questions.
There are more questions? I hope there are a bunch of them. Hi. Why don't you stand up? And could you do a favor and introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Michael D'Elia. I'm a junior at the Prep.
Good.
And I'm here with the business club.
Excellent.
Just all the students here. On the topic of saving, it has been emphasized to us to save as much as possible, as soon as possible, for retirement. Mm-hmm. Is there any other advice you could offer us after college when we begin our careers?
No, well, look, I think that's basic advice, frankly. Save as much as possible, as soon as possible. The only thing I'd add is you also want to take, it's not just retirement, you'll have other goals and objectives in life. So you have to think about your savings around the various goals and objectives. So retirement for you will be, it'll be 50, 60 years off. It'll be 20 or 30 years in length, I suspect. And there you want to probably take maybe a bit more risk as opposed to savings for things that are near end. So the only thing I'd add is think about your goals and objectives, and then you have your buckets of savings that are attempting to achieve each one of those activities. And the only other point I'd make is try to be as automatic as you can about your savings. There are a lot of reasons why you don't want to save or you won't save. If you put what I do, I save every 2 weeks the same amount of money. And I've been doing that since I was your age. And it's proven to be wise because I don't have to think about it. So you make it as automatic as possible and you think about your various goals. And those might be 2 little things to add to your general overview of save as much as possible.
And there seem to be many companies now offering incentives to save,
Absolutely.
right? In a sense, the match or
The
buying
matches,
stock at a
absolutely.
discount, something along that.
Absolutely. And take advantage of those things for sure. There's a question up here.
Do you want me to stand as well?
Sure,
Yeah,
so
go
everybody
on.
can see.
Everybody's the same.
Mark Jennings, class of 97. I had two questions. One of the reasons I went...
Yeah, feedback.
Well, here, sit right here.
All right. And everybody can see. Can you move over?
Yeah, come on, right here.
One of the reasons I went to Fordham Prep was because of the diversity I felt I'd get, going to school in the Bronx, New York versus New Rochelle, New York. I was Iona grammar guy. And I'm aware that Fordham Prep is expanding internationally. And I wanted to ask you if you and your firm is expanding internationally, and how's that impacting your business? And are you guys taking fiduciary responsibility for your clients, as I'm sure you'd agree Fordham Prep instills on its
Absolutely.
alumni and students?
So first, I'm sorry, should I answer that question? You have
Sure. I got one more. If you can answer that one first. you want.
I've discovered I do them best if it's one at a time, because I will forget the second. So I also, when I lived here, I lived in New Rochelle, and so nice to see you.
I saw you on the train.
You were that kid.
I still
Father,
am.
Exactly.
mostly well behaved.
We'll
About to go to
expunge his
Jug right
diploma.
now.
That's fine.
So the answer to your question is yes, we are expanding internationally, quite dramatically actually. Mainly in our investment portfolio. So we have a very large, we're the second or third largest owner of real estate in the world. The vast majority, not the vast, much of that is in major gateway cities around the world, London, Paris, Germany, et cetera. We are one of the largest owners of ag land in the world. Much of that is in the western part of the US, but also we do in Eastern Europe row crops. We have a fair amount of land in Brazil, and we also own a lot of land in Australia, for example. And then we do a lot of infrastructure as well, and much that's around the world. We also have a large number of people around the world. We have a real estate subsidiary in London that's got over 1,000 people, and we have another 8 offices around the world. The answer is we always take fiduciary responsibility, frankly different from some other firms in what we do. I heard the father mention a phrase that we use. We describe ourselves as doing financial services for the greater good, similar to your phrase, and we take that very seriously.
The second question was something you said earlier about teachers not understanding some of the basic financial service things, whether it's balancing your checkbook or know how to check your credit score. Do you think that the high schools and college should start teaching that at a younger age, some of the basic things that students need to know when they go in?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things I did mention was my 7th grade math teacher, a woman named Ms. Rutsky. I will never forget her. Oh, tough. The week of April 15th, we always stopped and we did a 1040 tax return. And that was just great. And that just continued in different ways throughout. So I think schools can absolutely help people understand that. I think the most important thing to help kids understand is this thing around credit. I run into lots of kids who think they need a credit card because they need to start to build a credit score. I think you need a saving account before you need a credit card. And this credit obsession that young people have, some, I don't know if your guys have it, but some do. I think it would be helpful to not reinforce that while reinforcing the message you heard from your business team back there around savings as much as you can as early as possible.
And protecting their identity as well, right?
Absolutely.
Posting stuff on the internet.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back to the table.
He's behaving a lot better now than last time. I remember Mark. Yeah.
All's forgiven.
Well, I don't know. What else? We have a question over here. Yes, sir.
I've never been told I need a microphone, but in your opinion, what present practices prevail in Wall Street that you think have the greatest potential of adversely affecting our economy, whether they're under-regulated, whether it's speculation with foreign currencies? Can you share that with us?
No, sure.
And what your opinion is as to how it could be rectified if you were in control?
Look, I think the biggest challenge that's still going on Wall Street is so visible, and it goes back to your question about low interest rates. There is what's called a search for yield. Everybody on Wall Street now is trying to figure out where do we get that extra few basis points of return. We got a very low and flat yield curve. We got a lot of volatility in markets. We've got companies like Renaissance that does really well in basically data mining and finding relationships that others don't see. But I think there's clearly a stretch for yield that is going to blow up somehow. No one knows where, though, frankly. So it's not as though one sits here and says, oh, that's the place where the next subprime crisis is emerging. Well, that is a place where it's emerging. Secondly, it's clearly happening, and the government is trying to deal with this. I think there are still many companies out there that are encouraging bad behaviors on the part of individuals. Still an awful lot going on in the credit space for some individuals, for sure. I'm not opposed to them. I'm not yet sure how robo-advisors are going to work. We have to see how this new financial technology emerges. So the second thing that's going on is in this period of low interest rates, there are probably products and services that are being introduced that aren't going to do well when interest rates return to normality at some point in the future. That's a very vague answer because it's really, if one knew exactly where it was wrong, you try to fix it.
You have no idea as to what practices exist that, in your opinion, shouldn't exist, but they do exist, and we, innocent public, get affected.
Well, there's one, this is going to sound very, very self-serving.
By the way, you have a right to remain silent.
No, there's one practice that I do worry about, but I think it's going to be pushed out, which is there is a practice to get people to roll out of their retirement plans into individual IRAs. Now, let me be clear. We also offer individual IRAs, but the government is clearly worried about this. So you've probably heard about this DOL fiduciary rule. An outcome of that will be, I think, to slow this practice down. I think the practice of getting people who are in very good, safe retirement plans to take their money out of the plan so they can manage it themselves is probably for most people a net negative. Not for everybody, but for many people, I think it could be.
You still see the government beginning to introduce legislation that further delevers banks.
Yeah.
So they may not be able to pinpoint, but they probably feel leverage could be at the core. So if you continue to delever, you may in some way break the domino effect of another crisis.
I think that's what they're trying to do, but we'll see how it works. Yes, sir.
Hi, Patrick O'Shea, class of '95. So you mentioned the importance of infrastructure investment in society. You also mentioned that your firm has a large infrastructure investment. How do you see the role of public-private partnerships evolving and the leadership of companies like yourselves taking to make that an important part of our society?
Well, I think it's potentially a very, very important part of society because a lot of the long-term capital sits in private companies such as my own. In order to make something happen in an infrastructure space, you need public support to make it work, obviously. We have to figure out exactly how to balance that. You probably know there was a pretty embarrassing case of the use of eminent domain to take some land from one individual to give it to another. That is not the kind of public-private partnership that we need. But you look around, you think about things like what's going on in Flint, for example. I don't know for sure that there's a public-private answer, but it wouldn't surprise me if, in that space, water investment, something that private sector is very interested in, could play a part of the solution in that space potentially. So there's some opportunities there, maybe.
John, you had a question?
John Neary, class of '87, Fordham Prep. I'm wondering if you have any view on the future sort of philosophical direction of macroeconomic thought. The idea is picking up on recent articles of measuring currently unmeasured.
Right.
And I think about the Economist article from a couple of weeks ago, going beyond consumption, investment,
Right.
government spending and exports. About some of Michael Porter's work up at Harvard, when he's trying to measure things. I guess if we skip back a generation, gross net national happiness.
Right.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, if we measure the unmeasured, do you think it starts to get at some of the discontent that's out there? If you think about it, there's never been more people in the world ever than right now. There's never been more wealth than right now. There's never, as a percentage, been less highly impoverished people right now.
Right.
Yet there's never been more dissatisfaction right now. So
Right.
is there a philosophical evolution of political economics that can help attack some of this?
Well, yeah, look, I think your factoids are certainly right all across the board. One of the things that drives it, though, is people sadly or not, are very driven by relative position and frankly envy, for lack of a better word. In the U.S. we could describe it as keeping up with the Joneses. And when what you see is a small percentage of people getting more and more, even if you are better off now than you would have been 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, doesn't make you feel any better. So I think you probably saw, given the way you've raised the question, a recent article that showed, as the Journal of the Weekend maybe, while all your facts are correct, if you ask people are they better off now than they would have been the same class in the 60s, they tend to say no. And the reason I think ultimately is around this issue of income disparity as opposed to the absolute levels of income. So what does that mean? I think economic policy is going to have to bear down on this question of what, if anything, we can do that's fair and appropriate in the U.S. capitalist society around income and income redistribution. The other big thing I think that's driving us that we have to think about is we're going through one of those once in a generation, actually once every 100-year changes from, if we were here 100 plus years ago, we would have been talking about all these people coming off of farms going into an industrial society that was not very friendly towards them. We had union busing, all sorts of things. We now have the shift from an industrial kind of society to, call it an information age, where folks who are trained to manage and use and get value out of information do incredibly well, and the rest of us don't. So we have to have an economic theory of how we bring people along that's consistent with what happened around the industrial age. If you think about what happened around the industrial age, we had a number of things that worked really well. One is a really good public education system, not to take away from what was happening other places, but the public schools in New York took huge numbers of people, not just New York, Chicago, Washington, out of poverty and into middle class. Though it is now contentious, we had the rise of unions. Now, I admit now it's sort of contentious, but were it not for unions, I think we would have had a different world. And that helped to rebalance the balance of power between workers and employers. Frankly, we had a number of social programs that came into play that were really important about building a social safety net. And ironically, I've been thinking about this a lot, it was all, not all, much of it was led by a crusading, but in our eyes, moderate Republican of Teddy Roosevelt, creating a certain kind of ethos between the upper class and the lower class. So that's a big philosophical answer around what we need now. I think we need to help figure out how to make this bridge from one age to another, bringing people along with us.
Not to start, I just want to add on. Is that bridge inside the structure of macroeconomic thought? In other words, does C plus I
Yes.
plus G plus NX work anymore? Do we need, Keynes came up with that during the Depression. Do we need something different right now?
I think we need that plus more. And I had this debate with some folks in Silicon Valley, right, who think it's all about information, all about information. The point I made to them, that's fine, but the ability to do a search for any information in a nanosecond doesn't necessarily make you a more productive society. For those who want to do it, it makes your life convenient. So the biggest example of this is the television. The television came along, it made for great entertainment, people's lives were more enjoyable in lots of ways. Hard to argue that television made the society more productive in the sense of bigger GDP to support all of us. So I think you need both. You need to measure the ease of activity, which comes from information, and you've got to measure other things. I'm mindful of two things. Yeah, time
Just
is
one more,
not
maybe
our friend.
circling back to banks. Jack Garrity, class of 1960. There's been a big push, obviously, for bank and recapitalization or more capital. Do you think it's adequately done at this point, or has it perhaps gone too far and maybe restricted banks from maybe lending, hurt the economy, et cetera?
I think the answer is probably maybe restricted just a little bit. I'm not going to be one that says we should have banks that are undercapitalized again, but you can tell by the way banks are behaving through a number of things that they're not feeling comfortable providing all the kind of resources that they have historically done.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're done here,
Yeah.
Father.
All right, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.